Yeah, just in thinking about this time period, the ascendancy of Christianity or of Christendom, as some will talk about it, sort of the greater, more than just the belief system, but how Christianity impacted the entire world. As you pointed out, I think one of the very interesting topics around all of that is how does Christianity account for, occasionally take in other belief systems? How does it sometimes reject certain things but accept other things in?
This is Generous Theology. In this episode, Chuck and Brock contemplate Chapter 50, Philosophy and Theology, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy.
Is there syncretism that occurs, or are we talking about still a very unique Christian way of thinking that just simply accounts for the way people think in the world? And I think that's a really important thing to think about, not only historically, as we read about medieval philosophy, we absolutely have to account for that. There's the whole fact that Aristotle is not known yet at the beginning of the medieval period, and then in the 13th century, there's all this knowledge of Aristotle that becomes available, and it certainly has an impact on people's philosophy and the way they think about things. But even today, I think we have to think about it as well, because there is a sense in which, just as in late antiquity into the early medieval times, there was a necessity for Christianity to deal with the culture in which it found itself at the end of antiquity, and as a result, there still was a great deal of influence of Greek philosophical and religious thought, as well as Roman ideas, and you have to account for that, and you have to explain your own ways of thinking in ways that are understandable to people who are in that culture. And in that same way, I think today, you've talked about how we're even perhaps in the midst of a move to from more of a modernistic way of thinking to a postmodernistic way of thinking. And there is a sense in which, as Christians, we need to make ourselves understood in this context in ways that are understandable by people who live and breathe the worldview of the postmodern or the modern into the postmodern world. And so there's going to be, for sure, some engagement with modern into postmodern thinking. We may use some of the ideas of postmodernism to explain Christian doctrines. On the other hand, just as we can see that there are some places where it looks like some Christian philosophers have, swallowed some of these ideas whole, almost in whole cloth, or have been so impacted by some of these ideas that there becomes a syncretism and becomes a weakening of Orthodox Christianity. And we see that in certain cases in medieval times. And we also see those who try to fight against that, even that discussion. I don't know if that comes in this chapter, but we've talked a couple of times about how in the early 13th century, or I think actually it was maybe a little later, there was the Bishop of Paris who issued a list of a bunch of condemned propositions. And so whether or not we agree with all of those condemnations, it was an attempt to say, hey, look, we've got to be careful. We still have to hold to an Orthodox view. And the fact that we're contextualizing doesn't mean that we also swallow it up and accept the propositions that come with these other views. And in this, I think we have to learn from that today as well, that we certainly need to contextualize our faith. We need to explain our faith and our worldview, and includes our philosophy, and in a context where this postmodern view is the way people speak. But we need to do so in ways where we don't necessarily just simply accept as truth all of those propositions and avoid syncretism. So I think that's one of the reasons why I found this chapter, especially the first half on the Latin West, so interesting, because it does have a great deal of impact even in how we think of things today. So yeah, that's one of the other things too, by the way, that I just wanted to mention, because this seems like a good place to mention it as well, is Hoonan makes the comment that it is an old but persistent prejudice that medieval philosophy is basically theology, right? And he says Hegel, for one, was an influential advocate of this view, but now more recently, research has focused on medieval logic, on natural philosophy, and metaphysics in their own right. And now this perception of medieval philosophy and its relation to theology has changed. And so this prejudice that said, hey, medieval philosophy not all that important to think about because all it is really theology and we don't care about theology. I also found that to be an interesting and helpful comment to make because I think there is a great deal to learn both as Christians but also more broadly from medieval thinking. And yeah, it definitely is an interesting context. And I think Conan would say that all philosophers ought to be learning from medieval philosophy and get away from this prejudice that all it is just narrowly theology. So I found that to be interesting as well.
So well said, my friend. Thank you for that. It's so important to take some time to frame. And this is where the historical context matters and why reading chapters like this from these professors is important. So, one of the things that really struck me, it's very tempting and relatively common in our day to think of a narrative that the secular Enlightenment progressives have put forward, and that is the idea we've got science and you've got religion. And the idea here, of course, from that particular group of folks is that we're modern now. Progress has happened. We're moving away from older things, from outmoded things to something that's better. And that's a popular trope today, but we find in the professor's writings that even from the beginning, Christianity had an embrace of theology mixed with ontology or metaphysics or what's out there, for lack of a better word. First of all, the professors note that Augustine put logic, the study of logic, and even called logic the science of all sciences. And in his thinking, this was important to help believers adhere to the truth of revelation. And so we find here that this very counter idea that, in fact, logic is an essential aspect of a mature Christian path. Now, I think an interesting point of discontinuity is the issue. Where does the scientific inquirer, where should he or she put what some call human wisdom or human knowledge? And how should those conclusions, those evaluations measure against the subjects that the scriptures speak directly about? And I'll give you an example. I was talking to a dean at an Ivy League university, a brilliant, smart, studied in the classics, well read. And we were, of course, talking about Christianity. And at one point, she felt comfortable enough to say to me, I am not a Christian because the Bible talks about Jesus being resurrected from the dead. And she continued, I know that people don't rise from the dead. Therefore, I know that the Bible is speaking falsely. And she was being very open about her reasoning there. And so we have to say, Chuck, what are we going to do when we're presented with the reasoning of our own faculties and we're presented with something that claims divine authority? What are we going to do? And that's the problem. Now, Augustine thought that logic helped believers defend and even adhere to the truth of revelation. It wasn't just an apologetic tool. Okay, we have to learn logic because all of our opponents are going to be bringing logic and we can't get away with just our normal thing. We have to up our game. That's not the trope. The idea is that Christianity was always compatible with, and indeed, logic was a portion of the universe as given by God. And so from the very beginning, we have Christian theology that is integrated with philosophical element. And so that continues throughout the rest of the time. And what we see that there's a connection between matters of fact and matters of narrative, or put another way, between the data and what the data means, or put another way, the stories and values behind the data. And there, the Middle Ages saw discussions from so many perspectives. There is very hard to limit because there were so many different directions that people thought about in. And it really was a marketplace of ideas. So we have Christians interacting with the Gnostic tradition in the very early church, which sort of was the Greek mulligan stew of what would later become under Plotinus and others, the Neoplatonism. And then we have, of course, Islam bursting out in the 6th and 7th centuries, and really having a force in the literal sense, a force in medieval culture. And then, of course, there was always the other viewpoints that came down from the other cultures. Nobody went with Christianity into a culture that was a tabula rasa, that was a blank slate. And so there was always this push pull. And in some sense, the exploration, the expansion of Christendom, the successes, the failures, is a working out of what that revelation in those scriptures mean. And in the marketplace of ideas, what does that mean relative to the beliefs of the other people that's there? And so I love this center point here that the professors do in talking about logic and bringing up, for example, the role of Islam. You and I have talked about Islam before. What were some of the aspects of how that came onto the scene that just changed the whole dynamic, the whole course of history, in your view?
It's interesting. Now, I will say that I think I maybe even mentioned this last time that I get a lot more out of the Christian West half of the chapter than on the Islam part of the chapter by Wisnowski. Although I think some of that is just simply because I have so much more background knowledge as to Christianity, being a Christian, for example, but also having studied some of this, whereas I have very little background knowledge in Islam. And so, for example, it was just really interesting to me in reading that section about Islam, even the understanding that there were not just, as I thought, two forms of Muslim thought, Shia and Sunni, but that there's also this version of Islam. I had to do a little bit of looking that up and trying to find out a little bit more about that. But that said, there was, in reading the section on Islam, it is striking to me how there are some similarities that we can see between the way that philosophy and theology are dealt with in Islam and in the Islamic world as in Christianity. And there is some parallel between some of the arguments that are occurring in the Christian world, in the Western world today, and in the Islamic world. And so there are some real sort of parallels that are interesting to see. And among those parallels is in the same way that there used to be much more of a parallel, or even that philosophy and theology dealt with similar things and maybe in somewhat different ways, but in parallel with each other. But then they got off the rails, and theology has moved out of the general way of thinking in the Western world. There was also these concepts of kalam, which is the Arabic term for speech or discourse, but often refers to theology, and falsafa, which is the Arabic word for philosophy, transliteration, actually. And in reading that first section on Islam, there's a lot of discussion just simply of how in the medieval Islamic world, there was an increasing synthesis between kalam and falsafa, but in a way that made philosophy priority and theology or kalam less important in ways of thinking. And it is interesting. Wisnowski makes the comment that when you study the philosophers, Islamic philosophers of this era, that there has been a real change you see a real change in how Islamic intellectual thought moved, and it isn't just static. And then Wisnowski says, as obvious as such a notion may seem, it flies in the face of how Islamic thought has generally been conceived, meaning today there is a tendency, I think, in the West to think of Islam as being stuck in the Middle Ages, or even before that, and to have not changed at all, and when in fact it has. Now, there is also, I think, and he refers occasionally to it, although it does seem to be more of a modern phenomenon that then there becomes this reentrenchment. And what we see, for example, in Iran among the Shiites, what we see in Saudi Arabia among the Wahhabis, among Sunnis, is that there is a move to try to make the theology piece of that the king again. And again, that there may be some parallels in that to the moves by some Christians anyway to discount any use of philosophy. And interestingly, we see even in the Middle Ages, right? In the medieval times, we see a little bit of that. We see how the philosopher Lanfranc criticizes Anselm and says, Anselm, you've gone so far into philosophy that by trying to use reason alone to consider the Trinity, you're just, that's too much. You shouldn't be doing that. You should just, let's just stick with theology. And Anselm himself, he's not persuaded by that. He says, look, nothing that I've said is contrary to tradition. I'm just using this logical approach to show that the claims of Christian faith, the claims of the Trinity are sound, that and that we can use human reasoning to get those, and we can see that logically these ideas are coherent and rightfully true. And so I've done nothing improper. But Lanfranc is concerned about that and concerned about where that goes. And there's maybe perhaps a sense in which we've seen that even more strongly in the Islamic world today than we do in the Christian world, with those who would reject the use of modern philosophy are in a significant minority, perhaps even among Christians, even among Orthodox Christians. They may be a minority in Islam as well, but they certainly are a powerful minority, and certainly have a great impact because perhaps the two most powerful Muslim nations are basically under the thrall of that sort of way of thinking that rejects the idea that philosophy can say anything into theological or religious belief. But yeah, so that was one of the things that I found really interesting on in the section on Islam. You can really see some parallels. Besides that, besides just simply as I read a number of the different Islamic thinkers, just trying to learn a little bit about the basics of who are these thinkers and what do they think and what impact do they have today, and that was all new to me. It took me quite a while to get through that part of the chapter because I kept going back to Wikipedia and going back to various other sources on the web just to look up some of the terms that were being used. But it was very interesting. I'm interested too in what you thought about that and that section on Islam, and what are some of the things that you really gathered out of that.
Let me talk to that in a moment. The first thing I wanted to just affirm was you brought up one of the major interesting emphases in medieval thinking, and that was the difference between faith and reason, what role these two things might play. So we earlier were starting talking about Augustine's idea that one studies logic not as a means of keeping Christianity out of the fires of contradictory gotchas. Oh no, our opponents are going to come to us with things we can't answer, so we better be scientists as well, so we don't look foolish with our faith. Not in that spirit, but instead in the spirit of, hey, this is much a part of what's in the Christian's world as it is anybody else's. And right from the beginning of this medieval period, we have this embrace. Now that turns later, especially I would say, like you pointed out, with the rediscovery of Aristotle in the High Middle Ages, we have this idea among thinkers that there's a tension between them, and that'll eventually culminate in what we talked about earlier, this modern secular trope, where the secularist says, you have faith and I have reason, I have science, I have rationality. And I don't think Christians concede that ground. Now, coming back to the witness of Islam, we find that the breakout of Islam in the East posed an immediate interesting situation. So you have Islam, brand new, bursting out, being carried by the sword, as it were. And the very first areas where Islam is being spread after the sort of initial conquest in the Saudi Arabia area is, of course, this Greek Middle East, Eastern Mediterranean. And so you have the clash of something new and forceful in Islam with something sophisticated which is the entire thing. You and I have talked before about Alexandria, the sophistication of Alexandria as a capital city of learning in the Greek tradition. And the same thing up north you have in Antioch. And so you mentioned it a little bit. One of the interesting things is that in this clash between the irresistible force and the immovable object, we see lots of syntheses. And so for people living in those times, it strikes me that you're immediately faced with something that could cause confusion. I don't know if dysphoria is the right word. You have these clash of two cultures. You've got this long, sophisticated history, so many things to think about from the pre-Socratics through to Plato, through to Aristotle, who's of course lost by this point in time. The residue, it was still there in that culture. And now you have just this brand new religion. And on top of that, the same thing happened with Christianity, but there's a difference in the way that Christianity conquered the Hellenic civilization versus the way Islam would conquer. A very big distinction. There's the sword involved. And Chuck, I don't mean to be crass here. I really don't mean to be crass, but it's pretty amazing what will be acceptable to you when there's a person watching over you with a sword, or today in our modern parlance, when somebody's got a gun pointed at your head. All sorts of things that you would maybe never entertain now all of a sudden look philosophically viable when that situation is real. And that's what happened. Now, I don't mean to imply that everything about Islam was at the point of a gun. In fact, there are ways to see Islam as a continuation of what was happening in the Middle East even before. The Greeks and the Persians back in antiquity, even before Alexander the Great, the Greeks and the Persians were warring with each other. And even before that, the peoples in the Middle East were warring each other. And I would bring my army and I would conquer you and your region, and I would get rid of the elites. And when I say get rid of the elites, for the most part, I would kill the small subset that was absolutely not going to work with me. But then I would take the rest of you, the rest of your tribe that was willing to work with me as hostage back to my court. I need more aristocrats. I need more trained people, and you might as well be doing it for me. And so you have that interplay there. I don't mean to make it sound that Islam was something completely different. These syntheses did have to happen, and it's such a stark difference from what happened with Christianity. It is what came to me. And I think we have to ask ourselves these questions of authority. Why am I studying this? You and I today, you talked earlier about taking philosophy courses, and you and your wife, you took this course. How would your curriculum have looked differently if it was centrally mandated? If the government or the state or whatever authority you want to call it, because it could just be the cultural expectations. What if you wanted to study what you wanted to study, but the requirement was that you study these things? Now, there are requirements already to get a degree, so there is a curriculum in place, but I introduced this element of what if you were naturally liable to grow in one direction, but now the context has changed and you're counterculture, and you're not going to grow in that one direction that you would naturally grow because there's a coercive force that's going to put a stop to that. And the reason why I ask that, Chuck, is in the transition from today, from Christianity, from a majority part in the culture to the cultural minority, counterculture, Christians are going to be in the same spot. What are we going to do with our theology when it becomes unacceptable in society to hold to a young earth creationist position, for example? What are we going to do when it's not acceptable? The Overton window has moved and you have to believe in evolution. I think that's what happened in the Middle Ages. Some variant of that could be present here. And so that was my thought in that. And is there any way that you would build on that, or do you see a continuity in there with what we're talking about for today, or how does it strike you?
Yeah, I think it's interesting in that, and really it's the whole chapter then, not just the section on Islam. It is really interesting to think about how that idea of using, whether it's logic, and certainly the medievals were perfectly willing to use pagan forms of logic to their advantage, whether it's adopting those certain types of thought, or whether it is at least speaking in certain contextual ways. How much of that can we do with, and how much do we need to do that? On the other hand, watching out for when can we take that so far that we lose sort of the heart of who we are as Christians. And I think even that earlier in the chapter where there is that discussion about logic and the adoption of these ancient Greek forms of logic is a really interesting sort of discussion to have, right? There was a sense in which, Augustine, very early on, this is still in late antiquity, he emphasizes that logic is really only about the truth of connections between propositions and not actually the truth of what those propositions signify. And because of that, he said logic could be taken over from the pagans without any danger to the faith. And there's a part of that makes some sense to me. I think there is some, we're talking about logic, but it's also somewhat logical that if you define logic in that way, that it makes some sense. On the other hand, you can also see the seed in Augustine's view of the use of logic, of something that grew that I think was a little more dangerous. And Aquinas, I think, expressed a view that then there becomes a certain level of rationality, even human rationality, that we can rely on as not being impacted by the fall. And so Aquinas, and he may not yet have taken it too far yet at this point, but he expands that idea beyond Augustine, where Augustine just simply talks about the tool of logic. Aquinas expands it to the whole realm of intellectual rationality. And I think you can see the pathway then to what we get in modernity, which is this idea that, hey, we don't even care about exterior rules and revelation, because what really matters is internal to us as humans. And the internal human mind or the internal human soul becomes the absolute center of any form of thinking. And we get into this modern day where the self is of ultimate importance, and there's no longer a willingness to accept revelation of a God. And so, in the same way, I think we have to be concerned that that was a move from antiquity to modernity. We also have to be concerned about, as we move into postmodernity, that on the one hand, as Augustine did, there may be ways that we can adopt tools that are common in the intellectual culture of the day, as Augustine did, as others later did with logic, to maintain ourselves as Christians and maintain Christian views in the larger intellectual culture and to explain our views in that larger culture. But we have to also be concerned that we don't allow the use of those tools to develop into something more actually in some ways goes against the very orthodoxy of Christian views. And I think there is a sense even that the Reformation was to some extent a recognition that the Catholic Church had gone too far in certain ways. Now, not all of the Reformation was about intellectual history and philosophy and the connection between philosophy and theology, but that is a part of what happens with the Reformation. And we even see that, I think we'll see that next time when we talk about the chapter on faith and reason. We even see how Luther rebels a little bit against how far the church went in medieval times into sort of syncretizing